Hola, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos a mi cita médica. Me da muchísimo gusto que nos acompañen hoy porque vamos a hablar de un tema que a todos nos preocupa, que es la soledad y qué tanto la soledad puede afectar nuestra salud, no nada más mental, sino también física. Me da muchísimo gusto dar la más cordial bienvenida a mi cita médica al doctor Evan Benjamin. El doctor Benjamin es profesor investigador de la Universidad de Harvard en los Estados Unidos, del laboratorio Ariadne de la Brigham Women Hospital y la Universidad de Harvard. En fin, una autoridad en muchos aspectos en cuanto a implementación de soluciones para diversos problemas de salud pública. Y bueno, hoy vamos a hablar de uno de ellos, que es la soledad. Dr. Benjamin, thank you very much for accepting being
It is my pleasure. Show. Thank you so much.
Dr. Benjamin, tell us please about loneliness. How is it a public health issue?
Well, so first of all, let's get some basic definitions. What do we mean when we say loneliness? Because there's really two related issues. One is what we call loneliness, and loneliness really is it's an unwanted feeling of being alone or isolated. Then there's social isolation. Social isolation is related to loneliness. That's really a measure of a person's interactions and contacts with others in their life. But it's important to recognize those are two separate things because, for instance, you can have a lot of social isolation but not be lonely. And you can be lonely with a lot of social isolation. So they're two interacting ideas, and it's important to recognize that. Secondly, we've just really begun to understand that loneliness and social isolation really are health issues. And we're starting to frame it now as a public health issue. We've learned that people who have loneliness can get into a vicious cycle where they are lonely. Loneliness actually increases sedentary behavior. It also changes our immune system. It's associated with anxiety and depression, which can then make individuals withdraw more, and then they become more lonely, and then they have more health effects. There have been a lot of studies about the impact of loneliness on health. And those studies have really shown that loneliness and social isolation, either separately or together, really have an impact almost as significant as other chronic health problems, such as smoking or diabetes or sedentary lifestyle. So it's a very important health problem today, and it's an important public health problem.
Yes, I was reading that loneliness could be equal to smoking 15 cigarettes per day. I was impressed by that.
Yes, and that's a nice number because people understand the impact of smoking. And that was an important study that was done a few years ago that said that loneliness has real impact on people's lives. It decreases longevity. It increases chronic disease to the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And I think that's a nice way for people to understand the significance of it.
Yes, so loneliness is a problem because of its mental problems that reflect on physical issues, but also by some behaviors that are related to loneliness that create a problem for the physical aspect of health.
That's right. And so here in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control reports that loneliness can increase the risk of diabetes, dementia, stroke, and premature death. So it's a very significant problem, and we believe that it's a preventable problem.
So let's make a pause and keep doing the interview. Vamos a hacer una pausa y regresamos más con este tan relevante tema. Estamos platicando acerca de la soledad con el doctor Evan Benjamin. Dr. Benjamin, who is at risk of being lonely?
So, as I mentioned earlier, how loneliness can contribute to chronic disease. Well, the converse is true as well. People with chronic disease are more at risk for developing loneliness. and then you could start that vicious cycle. So research has really shown that those people at increased risk for loneliness and social isolation include those with chronic disease, those with disability, those with mobility issues, makes sense, but also those with perhaps communication barriers from health or other cognitive impairments. Anyone who's suffered a recent crisis, a trauma, for instance, because they will tend to withdraw and begin this vicious cycle. People with economic insecurity seem to be at higher risk, and those, interestingly, who are caretakers for other people, because they're spending so much time really being a caretaker for others that they can get involved in their own world and not have the social connections and develop this path towards loneliness. A couple other before we go on. A lot of people ask me, is this a problem, more of a problem in the elderly? And the answer is yes, and. It is a problem more in the elderly, those greater than 65 and retired have more challenges and higher risks of loneliness and social isolation. But we also see it in the young, particularly those under 30, interestingly. And there's more research going on to understand why that is. The impact of social media perhaps is one theory, but we see it in certainly the elderly, but we also see it throughout all ages, and then also particularly in the young.
Yes, and I was just going to that part, to the first the elderly and then the young people who are more and more on social media, less and less being in personal contact with others.
Yes.
And that also affects and creates this feeling of loneliness, which makes the difference between being not social or not with people, but feeling that loneliness, what makes you sick, actually. So, and considering this point, Dr. Benjamin, how could we define this when it comes, for example, for migrants? Because in the United States, you have many migrant communities, and in the case of Hispanics that are used to in their own countries to have this family network really large, and then they come to countries like the United States where people are maybe less social compared to Latin Americans, and on the second part, their family is not here either.
Yes. Yeah.
So they don't have this network. How can these communities be affected by loneliness?
So first of all, just to add a little more color to what you said, we've been doing a project with New York City. New York City is a very diverse city, and the public health department there was very interested in trying to understand the impact of loneliness and thinking about loneliness as a public health measure. When we really did our research there, we found that certain New Yorkers were disproportionately affected by loneliness. And one of the populations is immigrants. I think in part for the reasons that you mentioned. It's a new world, but I think we should also name that there's racism, there's xenophobia, right? The fear of the other, and therefore the acceptance in certain communities of migrants. It could be a challenge and could contribute more to loneliness. So that's one population. Just to mention, the other populations in New York City that we saw at higher risk were LGBTQ for similar reasons, feeling isolated, and again, perhaps due to fear and homophobia, low income populations, and I think part of that may be due to having the resources and the classism sometimes that we see. And then finally, the disabled population as well. So those were 4 particularly high risks communities in New York City.
Let us do a pause and keep on with the interview. Hacemos una pausa y seguimos con esta interesante entrevista con el doctor Benjamin. Volvemos. Gracias por seguir con nosotros en Mi Cita Médica. Continuamos conversando con el doctor Evan Benjamin acerca de la soledad. Dr. Benjamin, the Centers for the Disease Control and Prevention in the United States state that half of the people in the U.S. are feeling lonely. So this is a very, very big issue. And on the top of that, we have the pandemic.
Yes.
So how did the pandemic affect loneliness?
So I think this has been a problem for some time, even before the pandemic. I think our modern life has created this loneliness and social isolation. We've done a number of studies. National studies have been done. We've done studies in New York, showing that up to, in New York, 59% of individuals feel lonely or have felt very lonely in the year prior to. So it's been an underlying problem. That data was actually 2019, before the pandemic. We know that the pandemic has also accelerated that. Like everything, the pandemic has just accelerated the inequities that we see in life and all the other challenges. Obviously, when we went into a shutdown and people were in their own homes, that was a big challenge. And then emerging from the pandemic, there's still a lot of fear. People are not as comfortable going out to doing the activities they used to do, to have the same social interactions. And I think particularly in the elderly population, or those who are chronically ill or immunocompromised, they may have gone to a weekly game with their friends. And they increasingly are missing those games because they hear someone else is sick, or there's a surge of COVID. So we're still seeing the impact of the pandemic to keep people to themselves, to protect themselves. But we've seen real impact. And a lot of people have questioned, which is worse, the loneliness or the risks that we're seeing from COVID? And I think those are good questions.
Yeah, yes, of course. So what can healthcare providers do in order to fight loneliness? What can they do with their patients?
Sure. So I think it starts first with remembering healthcare providers they're uniquely suited to identify patients with loneliness, in part because some of the manifestations of loneliness present as health problems, either perhaps mental health problems of depression and anxiety, but also exacerbating chronic problems, diabetes and hypertension. And so it's important for providers in the healthcare community to recognize that they may be the first to recognize that someone is suffering. And so creating that awareness for providers, educating them that there is an epidemic of loneliness, and then educating them on specific steps that they can do. And it starts with, first of all, normalizing it. And I think providers, doctors and nurses, they need to recognize that it's normal. It's very prevalent, and there is a stigma associated with it. Patients don't want to say, I'm very lonely. And so providers first, they need to recognize it. By the way, there are some national screening tools that have been used, very simple tools. There's one from UCLA, it's a 3-question test. But even just having the conversation to say, gee, the pandemic has been difficult on us. There are times when I find myself lonely. How has the pandemic affected you? Or how are you doing? Or do you find yourself lonely? And then normalizing it, saying, hey, this is a problem for many people. This is not just you. And let's think about how we can help. So the first step is awareness of the problem, normalizing it, trying to decrease the stigma as much as possible. Then we could talk about very specific things, and then I think it depends on the community. One is to try to focus on quality connections that a person may already have in their world, and their family members and others, to make sure that they take advantage of those quality connections and they don't let those disappear. To make those phone calls, to accept the calls when people are, rather than saying, "Oh, I'll deal with that later." So build on the connections that exist, and then also try to reduce barriers to other connections. We talked before about not going to your weekly, card game because of fear. Well, perhaps we could talk about how you still could go to the game, and you could see your friends, but we could also reduce the risk. You could wear a mask to those games, or you could have everybody test for COVID. So the four of you felt more comfortable. Perhaps there are transportation issues to overcome, or trying to get people who have mobility problems to supporting them. So there are real, substantial, concrete things to do to say, what are the barriers to keeping you there? And I think providers can do that.
Let's do a pause and go to our final block. Vamos a hacer una pausa y regresamos a la última parte de este programa, Mi Cita Médica. Volvemos. Gracias por seguir con nosotros en Mi Cita Médica. Estamos platicando con el doctor Evan Benjamin acerca de la soledad y sus efectos en la salud mental, pero también la salud física. Dr. Benjamin, what can be done?
So there's a lot that can be done. We are in the process of learning more about the drivers of loneliness, and we're trying to create specific interventions, specifically for healthcare providers and others. A big frame that we like to think of is, we have loneliness and we have social isolation. The real frame to think about is the antidotes to loneliness and social isolation are connectedness and belonging, right? So how do we promote connectedness and belonging? Belonging it's a feeling of you're accepted, right? Wherever you are, you feel accepted in your work, in your friends, in your family. To feel belonging is so important, and it's a real antidote to social isolation. And connectedness is not as deep as belonging, but it's still feeling connected. It's having social interactions which help drive the antidote social isolation. So we talk about how can we promote these connectedness and belonging. Earlier we mentioned, first of all, as providers, normalize it, decrease the stigma of it. Super important. Within the healthcare system, within a practice, often a practice will have nurse practitioners, community health workers, social workers, others in the practice that a doctor could say, I've identified this person as lonely. I'd like to have you guys follow up and see them, make a phone call to that person if there's a home visit. So within the health system itself, there's opportunities to actually do direct interactions. We also talk about the fact that when patients come to you in your office, that's a social interaction, right? Mm-hmm. Have your staff think of it as a meaningful interaction. It isn't just doing the paperwork and having a seat in the waiting room. There's a moment there that it's subtle, but it's a social connection. And how can the visit itself be a social connection? And then there's in communities, many communities have places that we can refer to, community centers, senior centers. There are programs where people meet up to play games, to have interactions. Sometimes they're based on interest, sports. And so that's very unique to a community, but they're not hard to find. And becomes a resource for a provider making a referral.
Dr. Benjamin, thank you very, very much for your time and sharing your knowledge. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Así es como llegamos al final de este espacio. A nombre de todo el equipo que hace posible la realización de este programa, muchísimas gracias por el favor de su atención. Hasta la próxima.